So what can you expect when raising bilingual kids? Let's get into it. I'm going to start with some myths about bilingualism. True or false? And you guys, again, can answer in the chat. My child will start talking later than other kids. I feel like we should have that music.
So far, it looks like about half and a half. It's like
okay, very cool. Okay,
possibly.
People aren't sure. So this is false. Introducing more than one language will not confuse your child. Bilingualism does not cause language delays, and bilingualism does not cause language disorders. So children are born ready to learn one language or more. In fact, actually, most people in the world are bilingual. There's different estimates, but about 60% of the world is bilingual. So it is a very normal state of the world, a normal state of humanity, and certainly something that's natural for people. Language delays and disorders are just as likely to occur in bilingual kids as in monolingual kids. So that's important to note. If your child is having difficulty acquiring language, whether they're monolingual or bilingual, I recommend that you consult a speech-language pathologist. And you would definitely expect, if your child is having difficulty learning language, acquiring language, that they would have difficulty in all the languages that they're acquiring. It would be across the board. Okay, let's go on to another one. Children are like sponges. They will pick up any language they are exposed to. True or false?
So far, looks unanimously true.
Okay, so this is false. Well, this is kind of the opposite of the first point. So in the first point, people think it's so hard to learn more than one language. It's so difficult. It's not a natural state for young children. And we know this is false. It's not the case. But the idea that it's so easy, that it's so effortless, that's false too. It is estimated that 1 in 4 kids raised in a bilingual home will not become bilingual. 1 in 4, that's, 25%. So that's a pretty significant number of children that are raised in a bilingual environment that will not become bilingual. It does take effort. It takes effort for the children, and it takes effort for the parents. It's not a passive process. It certainly takes time, especially if your child is learning additional languages outside of the home, at daycare, or at school. It's a slow, long process. It's effortful. One thing that I think is beautiful to see is that children do it with a lot of joy. So I wouldn't say it's like a sponge. It's not a passive thing that just happens to them. They are very active participants and they have to work hard at it, but they love it. They are usually quite enthusiastic and they're not afraid to make mistakes. Of course, it's not every child, but if you compare children to adults that are learning a language, you see that difference. And what is true about the difference between children and adults is that young children are more likely to sound like native speakers if they receive adequate language exposure to both their languages. We'll discuss soon what adequate means. But it's not always the best to introduce several languages at a young age. It might not be the right time, and we'll discuss that in a little while. Okay, here's another one. My child will only be bilingual when they can read and write in both languages. True or false?
So far, looks like the predominant answer is false. We have a true. For the record, I don't know the answer either.
No, that's okay.
Something that I honestly don't know. Yep.
So this is false. Yes, you guys are on the right track. So this is false. Being literate in more than one language, it might be a goal for your family, and it's a great goal. Or it might not be a goal for your family, and that's fine too. It's certainly possible to achieve literacy in more than one language. Sometimes it's called biliteracy, and we'll discuss strategies for that in a little while. Especially for those of you that have school-aged kids. Now, your child would still be bilingual even if they do not read and write in a second or third or fourth language. So it's not the end-all, be-all criteria for bilingualism. And the last one here, my child will speak like a native speaker in both languages. So true or false? If I raise my child like, from a young age as a bilingual, my child will speak like a native speaker in both languages.
So I see some falses, a few more trues, and depends.
Yeah, I would say those are all correct because I said it's a myth because there's this, sometimes we have such high expectations, I think in Montreal especially, that you should pass as a native speaker in both languages to be truly bilingual. And this is false. You can for sure be bilingual with an accent or with mistakes, with grammar mistakes, and with a weaker vocabulary in one language than the other. So most bilinguals are not perfectly balanced bilinguals. In reality, becoming bilingual takes a lot of effort, both for the child and the parent, and it's totally normal for children to have dominance in one of their languages. So your child most likely already has a dominant language. This is the language where they don't hesitate as much. Their vocabulary is richer. They speak in longer sentences. And your child might feel more comfortable in that language. Or maybe your child would feel comfortable in one language in one context, like cooking, because they have the vocabulary of cooking, the spatula, etc. And in another language, in another context. So maybe their math homework, they can't discuss it in your home language. They can only discuss it in the school language. The dominant language is very important. It acts like a foundation to help your child learn the other languages. So it's really important that we continue to support the dominant language. And so here's a little example of that. That dominant language is going to help you build bilingualism. And the dominant language can shift over time. So maybe right now your child's dominant language is the home language. If your child is young, especially before they enter school, sometimes this is very common. Once the child enters school, their dominant language tends to shift towards the school language, which would be French or English most likely. So these actually turn out to be myths about raising bilingual children. And in fact, there are so many myths about raising bilingual children. In general, what can you expect? You can expect that your child will have a dominant language and that will be their language they're most comfortable in, most fluent in. I'll give you my personal example. I grew up speaking Hebrew at home. So for many years, I had the vocabulary of cooking, cooking methods and appliances and everything in Hebrew. All our cookbooks were in Hebrew, and that's what I was exposed to. But when I was a teenager, I started watching the Food Network. I was very interested in cooking. So that's the first time I learned words in English like spatula, simmer, and things like that. And I still didn't have those words in French. I started, learning that when I was in university because I had done an exchange and I lived with a host family in Chicoutimi in Quebec. And so I learned the French equivalent, like la spatule, mijoter, words like that I just didn't even know until I was already an adult pretty much in French. So these things can happen. Your bilingual development can vary by context. So let's talk about bilingual outcomes, the end goal kind of. What can you expect? There are 3 basic outcomes that we can expect in childhood. One would be, you could say, best case scenario. One you could say would be worst case scenario. And then one would be in the middle, in between the two. And actually, that's where most kids end up. So let's talk about the ground floor bilinguals. What is this term? This is a term that's used by linguists to explain that none of the child's languages are at an age-appropriate level for learning. This is a problem. So if your child speaks 2 or 3 languages, but none of them are at the right level for learning for their age, then this means that they will have more difficulty understanding instructions, being able to participate in a classroom setting, being able to keep up with a curriculum. It might be the case that they are not getting enough input in each language, or maybe your child truly does have learning difficulties, maybe language learning difficulties, maybe even a language disorder. So you have to remember, again, language disorders are not caused by bilingualism. It's just as likely that a bilingual child will have difficulties or a language disorder as a monolingual child. And I encourage you to consult a speech-language pathologist that understands bilingual development to get an evaluation to determine if your child needs speech therapy. Now, most kids end up being middle floor bilinguals. So this means that at least one language is at an age-appropriate level for learning. So your child can use other languages, but they're just not as good at them. Maybe they can use them pretty well, but certainly one language seems to be adequate for learning. This is normal. This is where most bilingual children are. At least at some point in their bilingual development, this is where they usually are. Now, here we see top floor bilinguals. This means that more than one language is at an age-appropriate level for learning. So these are the kids that get the most cognitive advantages or thinking advantages from being bilingual. You might have heard that there are certain advantages to being bilingual. Some people promote it very heavily, and I do too, but we have to realize that not every bilingual has those advantages. That actually only happens when you have pretty high competence in 2 languages or more. Now, the good thing is that you as parents play a really important role in your child's bilingual outcomes. So with careful planning, with creativity and positivity and resourcefulness, you might be able to help your child go to the top floor. You know, this is not an unrealistic goal, but it does take planning. So we're going to get into that.